Welcome to Women of Worth, or WOW. I'm Michelle Martin, and in the studio with me, one of my favorite authors. I think she is one of the world's most foremost thinkers. It is an absolute pleasure and a privilege to speak with the author of A Bigger Prize, Margaret Heffernan, also the author of, I'll just say it, my favorite book in the world, Willful Blindness. Margaret, thank you for writing this book. I think it speaks to something most of us feel, but haven't quite been able to express, in that competition is important, but it isn't everything, as you say. There is a bigger prize. Why did you want to write this book?
Well, it really came out of willful blindness. There was a section of willful blindness where I was looking at the banking crisis, and I interviewed the head of a big bank who said, look, Margaret, we didn't want to sell subprime mortgages and all these terrible financial products, but we're in competition for salespeople, and if we couldn't let them sell these high commission products, they'd leave. And that really stuck in my head. And I thought, hang on a second. This is not the way competition's supposed to work. The theory is that when you have lots of companies competing, they'll produce lots of different kinds of products and consumers will have lots of choice. But actually, in this case, everybody was selling exactly the same thing. And of course, that's why the banking crisis was such a crisis. If only one bank had been selling these things, we wouldn't have had such a disaster. So that just sparked a question in my head, which was, okay, so if that part of the theory doesn't work, are there other areas in which competition just doesn't work the way we think it does? And boy, once I asked that question, I found out a lot. And, I'll be honest and say a lot that's in the book was an eye-opener to me. I had no idea before I started my research really quite how toxic competition could be.
You start with the effects of hyper-competition within a family, and then you draw from it linkages to your own father, who was a bully. Can you share with us a little bit about the fallout on competition within families? Because when people think of competition, they think of that first family, or they think of Cain and Abel, and they think it's hardwired into us.
And it is and it isn't. I think, nobody really knows why some kids are more competitive than others. It's very clear that parents can increase the competition or decrease the competition in terms of the way they bring up their children. And it was very clear to me, I think, through a lot of my childhood that my father was unbelievably competitive. And what he felt was he didn't really want to hang out with people who were less successful than he, because they were obviously losers. And he wanted to, but couldn't quite stand being with people who were more successful than he was, because he was too envious and they made him feel like a loser. Well, that meant he didn't have any friends. And my father was a really bright, interesting man who loved good company, but he couldn't really find any. And I think that was a really early moment in my life when I thought, this huge competitive streak is not serving him well.
I was interested in this book because we've done several shows on the rise of individuals with narcissistic personality disorder, and in this book you touch on that briefly. Can you draw the linkages between a competitive world and the rise in narcissists?
Yeah. So I think the message that a lot of people grow up with is it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, and if I don't make me the best at everything all the time, if I'm not constantly focused on my success, then I don't have a chance. And of course what that does is it means all those individuals are doing is thinking about themselves. So that's intrinsically narcissistic. But then when it gets really dangerous, as opposed to just unpleasant, right, is when they're successful, they think it's all me, and they also feel invincible. And one of the things that the research shows is that very narcissistic leaders get to a position where they think they can do no wrong, nothing that they do could be wrong. So that means that they won't really listen to anybody around them. And I think we've seen many people in leadership positions make foolish and catastrophic errors because of this narcissistic belief that they're invincible. And one of them is Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who used to run the IMF, who's been caught in sexual scandal after sexual scandal. I would argue that one of them is John Brown, who was chief executive of BP, who, really made some very, very poor decisions throughout his career. So and narcissists feel that they have to keep living up to this big PR engine they've built around themselves. And that leads them into doing bigger and bigger deals until finally something just breaks.
You quote the former CEO of GE, Jack Welch, who says, strictly speaking, shareholder value is the dumbest value in the world, and yet we continue to justify high-paying salaries or bonuses, and this idea that corporations need to maximize shareholder value as their main responsibility. Can you explain how the myth of the shareholder value leads to corporate problems?
Yeah. So there was a very influential paper published several decades ago that said the only business of a business is to maximize shareholder value return. And for some reason, this really stuck. And indeed, I've talked to many CEOs who believe that this is what the law says, although actually it doesn't. But it's a fantastic alibi. If you say, I have to get the stock price up every day, and that's all I have to do, then that can justify all sorts of nonsense. It justifies what the legal scholar Lynn Stout calls fishing with dynamite, which is you do whatever it takes to get a big short-term boost. And you don't really care about the longer term because the chances are you're not going to be around for that. And because lots of shareholders don't hold stock for very long, they may not care very much about that. So it really encourages short-term thinking. The other thing that, the reason that it's so interesting that Jack Welch finally came to the conclusion that it was a dumb idea is that it's very clear when he was running GE, for I think 40 out of 42 quarters, they hit their earnings target to the penny. Now, it is statistically impossible for that to happen naturally. So what that means is a huge amount of time, effort, and energy in GE was going into the accounting to make that happen. That's a really unproductive use of talent and energy.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
How do the outsized expectations of CEOs to live up to this idea, this cultural notion of being the rugged individualist, the hero, how does that hurt organizational culture?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think we have a kind of business culture that says a leader is the rugged, tough, as you say, heroic soloist who knows everything. Mm. Okay, so let's accept to begin with that that's impossible. But they still feel this pressure to do that. And very often what that does is it drags them into what's the quickest way I can do something really big and noisy and heroic.
Transformational.
Yeah. Well, the quickest, easiest way to do that is through mergers and acquisitions. Go off and buy some things. Buy a big company. Now, we know from the research that 50 to 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail. This doesn't seem to deter people. They still do it. And we've seen, really around the world, some truly disastrous mergers and acquisitions. BP, prior to the Texas City accident, the Prudhoe Bay accident, and Deepwater Horizon accidents, went through a huge period of mergers and acquisitions, which meant the company was saddled with debt, which meant it had to do lots of cost-cutting, which I would argue, and many others have argued, led directly to those disasters. I live in England. One of the biggest banking catastrophes of all the banking catastrophes occurred in the Royal Bank of Scotland after it tried to do, and this is just a classic, the biggest banking deal in history to create the biggest bank in the world. And to this day, the bank doesn't work. It is mired in debt. Every so often it has technical breakdowns so that the customers can't even get to their own money. And many people I've spoken to who still work there think the bank is so complex that it will never be able to fix itself.
One of the clearest ways I think us as individuals we can feel competition is through this idea of forced rankings. And in the school system here, streaming is is something that leads to a lot of pressure for both students and parents. But you write about how forced ranking leads to an undermining of long-term drives. Can you share more with us?
Well, there's sort of two pieces to this. The first is that in forced ranking, whether in schools or in companies, the people involved quickly figure out that the biggest stress is at the top and the bottom, right? There's big stress at the top because there are high expectations which you might disappoint, so huge pressure. And huge stress at the bottom because the fear is you'll be thrown out or you'll drop out. So the safest place is the middle. But the middle is about doing well enough. So although this system is thought to be motivating, the truth is it mostly demotivates the majority of people. So what you find in forced rankings is people in companies that use this mechanism will try very hard to be pleasers, very hard to get along with everybody, but not to do anything too risky or too different or too innovative because that might provoke a response. It might be too risky. So when it comes to innovation, which requires at least intellectual risk, nobody's going to do that. They just want to keep their heads down and keep going. In schools, there are two problems with rankings. The first is it teaches kids not to help each other. So I interviewed a parent who said that her daughter was in the top 5. Mm-hmm. She was having trouble with a homework assignment. So she asked one of her classmates, who was also in the top 5, and his mother said, don't help her. If she does well, you might lose your spot. This is a terrible, terrible lesson for life. The other thing I would say is, you have a very inspiring and inspirational educationalist here at St. Joseph's Institution, Dr. Coe, who has eliminated the talent versus the non-talent class. He's mixed the students in his school. He has not found that results have suffered. He has not found that it's any harder to teach. And he has found that, of course, this is much more motivating for all of the students instead of just a few. And I think his point is a profound one, which is he said, in life you're going to have to work with lots of different kinds of people. How are you going to learn to do that if you never do it at school?
And I think it's important to note for the listeners that when you talk about critiquing competition, you're not saying avoid conflict. That's not what you're talking about at all. In fact, you say collaboration is not soft.
Right. Collaboration requires a lot of conflict, give and take, argument, debate, and so on. It's actually very hard to do well and effectively. So I'm not saying, it's all about chumminess. And in fact, many of the super collaborators I interviewed are really ferocious on this, that, this great collaboration requires that everybody take responsibility for the whole, that everybody bring of their best. But of course, when it works, it means there's so much more to play with. There are far richer ingredients and contributions, and the possibilities are much.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
Hyper-competitive people compete in inappropriate situations because every social encounter represents an opportunity for power, control, or domination that can either be won or lost. Some researchers also regard this as an extreme form of individualism because of personal advantage and narcissistic self-interest overwhelm all other concerns. Hyper-competitive people can feel successful only when others lose. I recognize now that my father was hyper-competitive. The youngest and smallest of 3 boys, he was born into a poor Texas family where there was never enough of anything. He hated his brother. He hated his brothers, left home as early as he could, rarely contacted them, and didn't attend their funerals. He'd grown up with a burning desire to get as far away from home as possible. This served him well professionally, but it also left him determined always to prove his superiority. If he met people whom he liked but who were less successful than he, his contempt shone through. Attracted to people who were more successful than he was, his sense of relative failure impeded any possible friendship. He was an adroit negotiator but a very poor judge of when to stop, good at achieving his goals, but graceless in victory. When negotiating complex agreements between oil companies and national governments, his ambition was not to secure a workable deal, he once told me, but to break his opponent's spine. Perhaps he was the only one to be surprised when his employer retired him at the earliest opportunity. My father's competitiveness made him a bully. That stood me in very good stead in my own career, in which I encountered perhaps a disproportionate number of people rather like him, gifted, intelligent thugs. This wasn't industry-specific. They were as prevalent in broadcasting as in software development and venture capital. Many had a great deal of power, which was the chief reason people worked for them. No one would have done so by choice, and most left at the earliest opportunity. Growing up around this kind of personality left me with a shrewd idea of how to deal with it. I was good at avoiding confrontation, but canny when accepting it. But most of all, it left me with a profound sense of waste, of talent undermined by its own aggression, and of a desire for human connection that was perpetually subverted by the need to triumph. I loved my father, but I could see that he was trapped, isolated and ostracized by a drive he could not control.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
my
so
pleasure.
much. Can I just ask you a few questions?
It makes me
of
feel
women?
so sad thinking about him.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah.
It was really funny. My sister just read the book, and she said, you were exactly right. And I thought that's quite nice, because she saw the same thing.
But is this something that you came to see about him later on in your life? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially when I was, I guess, a young adult, kind of watching him and thinking, wow, he's not getting out of these relationships what he wants.
I am intrigued in that it gave you the tool set to deal with individuals like that, because I encounter individuals like that all the time.
Yeah. No, it's really funny. I had an investor like that. And, I mean, it's really funny because we're still friends. But it meant, I knew exactly when to kind of stay off his radar. But it also meant if we were going to have a fight, we were going to have a fight.
But the charming, glib superficiality masks this lack of empathy, which to me is very frightening.
Yeah, and it's quite chilling when you discover it, because there's often, as you say, that sort of superficial charm. And you think, well, there must be something underneath it, and there just isn't.
Yeah, there really isn't.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's a little alarming.
It is, extremely. We'll come back on the record, and I want to ask you a little bit about your messages to women. Sorry, I'll start again. Okay. Given your research with women on top for that book, what messages do you have to women who are climbing the corporate ladder and dealing with unconscious bias at work? That's what we call it now. We used to call it,
bias.
Prejudice.
Yeah. It's interesting because I still do a lot of work with women in corporations, and I think the most important thing for them is not to try too hard to fit in. I think women have tremendous instincts and native talent, and we need women in corporations not to turn into guys, but to bring their own style of working and their own style of thinking. The whole point about diversity is it's supposed to surface a broader range of ideas and solutions because different people are around the table. It doesn't work if everybody tries to conform. And so what I often see with many women who are kind of mid-level in their careers is they're really torn between, do I fit in or stand out? And my advice always is stand out. You have a real advantage here. You know, you have real strengths. Don't let anybody persuade you to undervalue them.
I've heard of the tall poppy syndrome in Australia, and I'm sure there are many corporations here where to stand out would be dangerous. How can a woman survive then?
Well, I think, you know, one of the things I see women doing is saying, well, if I do stand out, I'll lose, so I won't. But how will she ever know whether she might have won? You have to have the courage to try. And I have to say, in my own career, I would say that being female and working in a female way has certainly contributed to my success. I would also say, you know, at an earlier stage in my career, I think I did try to fit in. I think it really constrained my thinking and my energy. And as I tried harder to develop my own style, it was infinitely more powerful.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.
In Women on Top, one of your previous books, you interviewed hundreds of female entrepreneurs. In your experience, do female leaders lean naturally towards methods of leadership that incorporate collaboration?
Certainly the research for that book suggested that they do. You know, in there I wrote about leadership as orchestration, that the leaders of those very successful businesses thought of themselves kind of as the conductors of the orchestra. So the one person who makes no noise, but whose job is to elicit the best from everybody. And that is a very collaborative style of leadership. And it's about getting the best from everyone as opposed to getting the best from just a few.
Your book is so wide-ranging, the bigger prize. You even move us to the realm of science. Why did you want to talk about the effects of competition and the pharmaceutical sciences?
Well, I talk a little about science, partly because I think people imagine that science is this pure quest for knowledge and it's not competitive at all. And in fact, what is the case is that the huge competitiveness of science is really getting in the way of solving some of the problems we really could solve if people would work together instead of against each other. And I think also, you know, there's some really interesting examples in pharmaceuticals where, again, the economic theory doesn't work. The theory is if different companies bring out the same product, it'll bring the prices down. That would be great for consumers. What we're finding is it does just the opposite. It's putting the prices up. So identical drugs, fundamentally, ratchet up their prices by doing the same thing. And this tendency to compete through copying means that companies are just making slightly, trivially different varieties of the same drug. What they're not doing is the really important stuff we need. For example, there hasn't been a new antibiotic for 10 years. We have multi-resistant strains of viruses, for example, and antibodies, and we have nothing to treat these diseases with. And health officers around the world say this is a crisis in medicine. But the big pharma companies aren't touching it. Much easier to just copy somebody else's drug, put the price up, and call it innovation.
For many people, competition is seen as the most equitable way to distribute resources. You say right at the end of the book you don't have a single blueprint and that there is safety in plurality. Is there an alternative to competition as you see it?
Yeah, my book is full of companies that motivate people, achieve very high levels of innovation and success through collaboration, through partnering with other businesses, through very flat hierarchies and very, very high degrees of freedom for the people that work in them. Freedom, trust, reciprocity. That this is much more creative and it's infinitely more sustainable. I think the thing that's so striking about competition is that it isn't equitable. It requires a small number of winners and a large number of losers. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing rising levels of inequality around the world. this is just dangerous. It's not just that it's unfair. It's not sustainable. It isn't stable. It is dangerous. And it's a waste of human resources.
Are you hopeful that there will be change given this cultural focus, as you say, is on the winners and not to notice collaboration?
Well, I've been quite heartened since the book came out, because as I go around the world talking to people about it, the look I see on their faces is sort of relief. It's like, oh, thank God someone finally said it, because we've all sort of been thinking it. But also, oh, thank God there are other ways to work. You know, and the very collaborative companies and organizations I write about in my book, they're not small, little, tiddly businesses. These are big, global, multi-billion-dollar businesses that are making huge strides and achieving terrific success by working differently. And my challenge is, if they can do it, anybody can do it. Hyper-competitive people compete in inappropriate situations because every social encounter represents an opportunity for power, control, or domination that can either be won or lost. Some researchers also regard this as an extreme form of individualism because personal advantage and narcissistic self-interest overwhelm all other concerns. Hyper-competitive people can feel successful only when others lose. I recognize now that my father was hyper-competitive. The youngest and smallest of 3 boys, he was born into a poor Texas family where there was never enough of anything. He hated his brothers, left home as early as he could, rarely contacted them, and didn't attend their funerals. He'd grown up with a burning desire to get as far away from home as possible. This served him well professionally, but it also left him determined always to prove his superiority. If he met people whom he liked but who were less successful than he, his contempt shone through. Attracted to people who were more successful than he was, his sense of relative failure impeded any possible friendship. He was an adroit negotiator but a very poor judge of when to stop, good at achieving his goals, but graceless in victory. When negotiating complex agreements between oil companies and national governments, his ambition was not to secure a workable deal, he once told me, but to break his opponent's spine. Perhaps he was the only one to be surprised when his employer retired him at the earliest opportunity. My father's competitiveness made him a bully. That stood me in very good stead in my own career, in which I encountered perhaps a disproportionate number of people rather like him, gifted, intelligent thugs. This wasn't industry-specific. They were as prevalent in broadcasting as in software development and venture capital. Many had a great deal of power, which was the chief reason people worked for them. No one would have done so by choice, and most left at the earliest opportunity. Growing up around this kind of personality left me with a shrewd idea of how to deal with it. I was good at avoiding confrontation, but canny when accepting it. But most of all, it left me with a profound sense of waste, of talent undermined by its own aggression, and of a desire for human connection that was perpetually subverted by the need to triumph. I loved my father, but I could see that he was trapped, isolated and ostracized by a drive he could not control.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
my
so
pleasure.
much. Could I just ask you a few
Oh,
questions?
it makes you
of
feel
women?
so sad thinking about him.
Yes, I'm sure.
It was really funny. My sister just read the book, and she said, you were exactly right. And I thought that's quite nice, because she saw the same thing.
But is this something that you came to see about him later on in your life? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially when I was, I guess, a young adult, kind of watching him and thinking, wow, he's not getting out of these relationships what he wants.
That is today's Wow Club with Michelle Martin, 1 minute before the news at the top of the hour.
Add to your wow factor with Michelle Martin in the Wow Club on 938 Live.